So Nadine Dorries, the former culture secretary, has told Ian Dale on LBC that she thinks the Tories will lose the next general election, and she thinks it's because of betrayal. Her idea is that voters are angry about the betrayal against Boris Johnson, and that's why the Tories will lose. She's called for a general election. Um, this is staggering. It's staggering arrogance. Um, Doris is one of the most outspoken of Boris's sycophants, but Boris Johnson's sycophant. I'm not going to call him Boris, because I think part of the whole thing with this man was that there was this kind of familiarity that was pushed out there. He was one of the few prime ministers who was just as widely known by his first name as his second name. We spoke about Blair and Thatcher and Major Cameron, but when it came to him, it was always Boris. Um, it was actually quite clever. But I think her attitude's a disgrace. It might be her genuine view, but she's either willfully ignorant or just clueless. That might be true in some Tory membership forums. Probably is. Johnson was very popular in the Tory base. But you don't win a general election by just having this echo chamber pitching to the base alone. Anyway, her attitude, it's not unique. Like I say, she's one of the most outspoken of Johnson's defenders, but she's not unique. There are others. Um, Quite frankly, the only Tories I have much respect for right now are those who are willing to introspect, and not by talking about betrayal, but introspect as to why the wider public is not satisfied with the Tories, with this party. It's not about one man or one woman in Liz Truss. It's about the party, actually, in my opinion. I think there's a number of things as to reasons as to why they're probably going to lose the next general election. I was thinking 2024 might be a repeat of 1992 or something similar, in the sense that in 1992, the Conservative Party was very unpopular. The major government, it was kind of before the worst sleaze had set in, but it wasn't particularly popular. Um, but so what happened was there was still a pretty comfortable victory for the Tories. In fact, John Major in that general election got more votes as party leader. I mean, as the Tories got more popular votes in any election, I think, ever, unless I'm mistaken. 14 million votes. That's even more than New Labour got in 1997. The 1997 election's better remembered because it was a turnaround, because it was the emergence of New Labour and Tony Blair was dynamic and all of that. Actually, Major's Tories got more votes than Tony Blair's Labour in 1997. That's remarkable. But in 1992, there was this kind of phenomenon of the so-called quiet Tory voter or the shy Tory voter. This is to say, people who voted Tory, but they didn't really shout about it or they were almost embarrassed about it. Probably because at that time, Labour was under Neil Kinnock. Kinnock, I wouldn't totally dismiss as a leader. I think he was sort of a bridge between Labour and New Labour. Think it would be wrong to totally dismiss him, but clearly there were mistakes in that campaign. His presidential style rally in Sheffield backfired, and the way it was. I think there were mistakes probably made in the campaign, and regardless, people were not quite ready to put their trust in Labour in 1992. It was gradually moving that way, but not quite. In other words, people were not particularly happy with the Tories, but they sort of thought, well, we'll go with what we know. I think that's what happened in 1992. So it was a huge surprise. And then, of course, Major ended up being Prime Minister for almost 7 years. But so I thought maybe 2024 will be like that because there isn't resounding support for Labour at the moment. Um, there is not huge personal support for Keir Starmer. There's not any great enthusiasm for him. So I thought, okay, it's going to be something similar. But actually, now I'm thinking the Tories are doing such a good job of making themselves unpopular that they might hand Labour the election victory. The way things are going, there's a lot of factors at play. Labour is doing very well in the polls. Now, polls go up and down, they're not concrete, they're not set in stone. But it would be easy to dismiss if it was a small gap. At the moment, it's quite a big gap. I don't know what the last points on Ipsos and YouGov and so on was, but it's quite significant. We're not talking about a little gap, a little. You might have that in a by-election or something, but right now Labour is doing actually pretty well in terms of being ahead of the Tories. Um, there's other problems at play and there's other issues at play. Firstly, I think the Tories very, very much underestimate public anger about this perception of states. I'm not suggesting that I speak for everyone, but I do think there are a lot of people out there who see this government, and by government, they think Conservative Party. It doesn't really matter if it's a different administration. They think Conservative Party as quite corrupt because Partygate, there were right wing presenters and Tory MPs trying to trivialise it and say it's just some sort of left wing plot. But we found out it was a lot more than a few drinks outside. It was a full scale party. Johnson lied about it. This happened in his house. This was at a time when the government had set some of the most stringent rules on mandated restraints on civil liberty in modern times, which most people accepted because of a deadly pandemic that had swept this country and the world. Um, so people accepted it. People done what they were told, broadly speaking. They understood that it was an exceptional situation. People done it. But I don't think they understand the anger, particularly from people who lost loved ones, but more broadly. That it's basically one rule for them and another rule for us. Johnson himself admitted that was a perception. He didn't really act on it. Because with Boris Johnson, it was one thing after another. Partygate was the worst, but there was a Dominic Cummings thing, there was a Matt Hancock thing, and in any government, you're going to have the occasional ministerial resignation over something. But in the 3 years of Boris Johnson, I think it was on another level. It was just one thing after another, and I think that their utter failure to introspect. With exceptions, I give credit to the Tory backbenchers who rebelled, but look at what happened at the time. They were totally vilified by the likes of Nadine Dorries. Um, she hasn't been shy of playing the victim herself and saying she's picked on social media. But this woman has, vilified anyone who doesn't basically blindly support the dear leader. And it's pathetic. She's not the only one, but she's one of the most outspoken senior Tories to have taken this attitude. And it's this blind loyalty to one man. The reason, I mean, I think it was right that they toppled Johnson, but clearly it hasn't been enough to change things. Because what did they do? They elected a woman who was another Johnson apologist. Throughout the campaign, Liz Truss went out of her way to kind of play things down and say, oh, well, he delivered us Brexit. He got the vaccine rollout. But let's not talk about Partygate. It's trivial. That was her attitude. And frankly, I'm not sure if any of those candidates, including the outsiders, really done enough to address public anger about that. I think Tugendhat and Badenoch were outsiders, but Truss and Sunak, especially Truss, one of the things I didn't like about her was the fact she kept saying, her failure to criticize Johnson. Here's the irony: the Tories have this thing about loyalty, like, oh, well, she was loyal to Johnson, that's why we've elected her. But she stood in a leadership election which was triggered by his downfall. So is it really loyalty? But, there's nothing honourable about blind loyalty to a corrupt figure, to someone whose behaviour damaged the reputation of the party. I mean, Boris Johnson done things that no prime minister in modern times did in terms of damaging public trust. Even Tony Blair, with all the controversy around the Iraq War, Tony Blair still won the 2005 election. Now, Blair is a deeply controversial figure, but He still won the 2005 general election after the Iraq War. What that tells me is that whilst the public might be angry about foreign policy issues, ultimately, it's domestic issues that they vote on, ultimately. Um, and I think when it came to Boris Johnson, there was genuine public anger about the corruption. I'm not going to say the perception of corruption. I believe it was outright corruption. His his support for Ukraine was certainly commendable, but there's things have emerged since this meeting he had with a Russian oligarch after a G7 summit in Italy. I think that warrants a lot more scrutiny. Um, it's kind of being ignored, but that might be something quite significant. Who knows? Maybe not. Maybe it isn't. But I do not think Boris Johnson's an honest person. I do not think people might say, "Oh, well, all politicians lie." No, I think Boris Johnson is an exceptional liar. Um, and for the Tories to just blindly defend it, it's pathetic. But so all of that corruption and those double standards, one rule for us and another rule for everyone else, it's infuriating, and I don't think the Tories get it. I don't think they get it. I also think they have this arrogant idea that they're born to rule because they have been the electorally most successful party in the country. They've had over a century, cumulatively speaking, of government. So they have a lot of experience. They've had some towering political figures over the years, but I think because of that, they have this idea that we are they've sort of this entitled sense of power. And I'm not saying individual MPs don't work hard, but as a party, I think they have an entitled sense of power. Like rather than saying we need to earn trust from the British public, it's kind of this idea that, oh well, we'll just attack Labour and then we've got it. That's it. That's fine. Um, Now, I want to be clear in all of this. I'm not overly enthusiastic about Starmer's Labour. I abhor, I loathe the pandering to woke ideology. I loathe it, and I think it's a serious problem. It would definitely be one of the things that would stop me voting Labour. Also, their attitude to crime, I'm not sure about. But, the Tories talk tough. They haven't really delivered, not anywhere near enough that I would like to see. Um, the fact that Tories aren't woke and they've spoken out against identity politics and so on is one of the very few things that kind of makes me think, well, that's something they've got. At least they don't do that. At least they don't play divisive identity politics. They don't. But that's one of the few redeeming features they have right now. The Trust government shamefully panders to the rich. That mini budget. The ironic thing is, apparently, people support a lot of the budget. But the part about not, capping bonuses for the rich, Quartering made a serious mistake with that. Even many conservatives, even many business people are saying it's a mistake. But this wasn't a case of this was the Chancellor going rogue. The Chancellor and the Prime Minister are on par with this. And I think they're both tone deaf. There was a cartoon in the eye the other day that showed them both as robots. Theresa May used to got mercilessly mocked by satirists as the Maybot. But I think she was a lot more I think she was more humble. I think she was more for whatever shortcomings she had. I think she was less arrogant than what we see from Truss and certainly from Johnson. I just think that this is a party that is heading for electoral defeat, and they're too arrogant to introspect. So when Doris said it's because we betrayed Boris, try looking outside the party. Try considering this idea she has. The British have this great love of Boris Johnson, and they think it was a great betrayal, and they want to see him back. Maybe some Tories do. I know there was petitions to try and get him returned as leader. But I really don't think that's the case at all. It's happened a few times in our history. Gladstone served on four separate occasions. The last time it happened in modern history was Harold Wilson's second tenure in 76 or 74 to 76. But it's rare. Most of the time, a prime minister serves one. period of office, then that's it, their political history. Um, but Labour, I think Starmer has been, I think he's improved of late. I think he's had more energy. I think he's become a lot more like a politician in a good way rather than just a lawyer. His dullness is not necessarily a bad thing because I think people kind of have finally seen through the caricature of Boris Johnson, the character, and they wouldn't mind a little bit of dullness. Now, Liz Truss is very dull, but the problem with Truss is she's tone deaf. I think Starmer is a lot more in tune with bread and butter issues. The biggest problem I have with Starmer is, like I say, he just panders to woke ideology. If he would just divorce himself from that, if he would just, you know, distance himself from that, I think I'd be a lot more enthusiastic about him. As it stands, I'm not overly enthusiastic. I think right now, this exact moment, he'd be better than Truss, definitely. And I'm not concerned about foreign policy because he's not Jeremy Corbyn. He doesn't have an anti-West worldview. He's been very clear that we need to be tough with Russia and China. So I'm not concerned about that. I'm really not. Um, but there's dogma in the Conservative Party that if in Labour it is to do with identity politics and woke ideology, that's their dogma. Within Tory ranks, it's probably two things: it's blind loyalty to Boris Johnson and Brexit. Like the Tories look at everything through the prism of Brexit. I'm not saying it isn't important, and there's still issues like the Northern Ireland Protocol to address. But Kimmy Badenoch was right to say that we need to stop thinking of everything through the prism of Brexit. Well, that's what she alluded to. Um, it doesn't matter if Truss is tough with Russia, which is important. I mean, I say it doesn't matter, but what I mean is that people ultimately will vote on domestic issues. It's good that she's tough with Russia. It's one of her redeeming features. I think she was quite a good foreign secretary. I always try to be fair to people, but she's tone deaf for public opinion right now. Totally tone deaf. And it's all very well playing the martyr and saying, I'm prepared to be unpopular, but she won't get thanked from that from her own party. She's taken a massive gamble. Like, she knows best, and well, this will play out in the long run, but I'm not sure that it will. Um, it's trickle down economics, and it's just, I don't think they grasp the optics of this. The people are struggling, and yes, they're giving support to households, but what people see is they see wealthy benefiting most, and it's fundamentally unfair. And this is the worst Tory caricature, and they're playing to it. They're giving cartoonists what they want. I mean, the perception of the Tories as a party for the rich, Truss and Kwarteng are going out of their way to give it give that perception on a plate. Um, David Cameron, Theresa May, and even Boris Johnson, who was, certainly, if you look at his biography, he was always, pro pandering to the rich. But for me, it's not even a thing about class wars or something like that. It's not about begrudging wealthy people for being wealthy. It's not about, this fiery socialism of let's all live in a communist sort of society. People are realistic. They're not anti-business. They're not anti-wealth. But at a time when people are struggling, to give the richest tax breaks and just I think it's just so tone deaf. So that's another reason they'll lose. Summed up, Labour is doing a few things well at the moment. They're starting to finally get the bread and butter issues. They're getting away from identity politics. I don't think they're out of the woods yet. They still, it's pathetic that Starmer and Rayner can't say what a woman is. That's one area the Tories have ahead of them. But, the Tories can't just bank on, whoa, well, we're anti woke. It's good, but it's not enough. Not anywhere near enough. Um, so, if Labour would just get rid of that and focus on bread and butter issues, I think, Starmer got ahead of Truss when it came to talking about immediate energy freezes and so on. Um, I think Labour is on to something. They're clearly doing well, and I think Labour would be very, very foolish to get rid of Starmer right now. So that's one thing. Labour is definitely on an ascendancy, and it is not just a case of, well, they're only doing well because the Tories are doing badly. I think they've genuinely got their act together on some level. On some level. Can't be complacent, can never be complacent. But the impression I got from Liverpool was that had to think what city their conference was in, was that they're not complacent. They understand that they can't just assume they're going to win. Because that mistake was made before Neil Kinnock in 1992. Um, but that's one issue. The other issue is that people are genuinely angry, I think, about Tory arrogance and this idea that they just think they're born to rule. Also, people are. I think there's another factor in it. Political parties naturally have a lifespan. In this country, it kind of goes like this: it's the Conservatives for a generation or a period, usually just over a decade, then Labour for that period. I mean, in my lifetime, let's look at my lifetime. 1985 was the last years of the Thatcher administration, the second half, right? 85 to 90. Then John Major wins the 92 election. He gets altogether almost 7 years. So the Tories in my lifetime, that's 12 years and 18 years altogether. It's a long time. So people want to change. They go to New Labour. 13 years, the 10 years of Tony Blair, 3 years of Brown's troubled administration. So they want to change, but they don't quite go full all the way to the Tories, so they go for a coalition. Then 2015, the Tories do enough to secure a majority. But now the Tories have been in power for 12 years, just approaching a similar period to what New Labour was. It will be next May. um, People want to change. So I think we're going to go back to Labour, and then that'll be a generation. It's just the natural progression of things. So all those factors is why I think the Tories are in fact going to lose the next election. They're going to have to do something really radical to really get public interest. I mean, Wartime was talking about it being a new era. I mean, a new era, but a party that's been in power for 12 years. So that's nonsensical. Maybe for him, because he's been promoted to Chancellor and the fact he's a new Prime Minister. But Truss really, it doesn't matter that she's the third woman in office. She's more of the same. She's really just a duller version of Boris Johnson. It's hard to see her much different. It really is. Because she has the same failure to sort of introspect. She has the same arrogance. Um, so I think this party is in a very serious way, and they've only themselves to blame. If the Tories would show a little bit of humility, just a little bit of humility, and accept there was genuine public anger over Partygate, accept that their infighting is doing them no favours. There's a lot of things. I didn't even mention the infighting. This constant sniping at each other. Oh, who's a true Brexiteer and who's not? That never helps any political party. Of course, you're going to have internal differences, which is fine. But when it's so public, when Tories are sniping at each other's blue on blue attacks, Labour must love that because, I mean, this isn't to say that Labour doesn't have its internal struggles, but these Corbynites who are sniping away at Starmer and saying he's a Tory in disguise and all of this, my point to them would be, okay, Starmer's not your ideal choice, but would you really rather Liz Truss and the Tories stay in power than have a Labour government? It's nonsensical.